Hello and welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson, and this week we continue our quest through the works of Lord Dunsany on the supposition that they've been written down by a retired redcap. Speaking of quests, this week we have the quest for the Queen's Tears, which, because it mixes a monster and a hero and a quest and a fairy queen, is one of the ones which is most directly useful for Ars Magica, and perhaps one of my favourites. Over now to Sandra Cullum, who read this into the public domain through the LibriVox project, and once again, thanks to Sandra.
Sylvia, Queen of the Woods, in her woodland palace held court, and made a mockery of her suitors. She would sing to them, she said. She would give them banquets. She would tell them tales of legendary days. Her jugglers should caper before them. Her armies salute them. Her fools crack jests with them and make whimsical quips. Only she could not love them.
Sylvia's name literally means of the woods. She seems superficially to be a dryad, however regal, but her nature, as the poem unfolds, makes her more of an ice queen, perhaps the queen of the winter forest. Her palace in the woods has an unnatural number of retainers. It may be in Reggio or in Arcadia. As a digression in this aside, during the podcast I usually inculcate commentary like this, interrupting the original document. The other alternative is to hold it until the end of the document and then say, you remember 10 minutes ago when we were talking about Sylvia? Well, her name means such and such. Which would you prefer? Mention it in the comments on the blog.
This was not the way, they said, to treat princes in their splendour and mysterious troubadours concealing kingly names. It was not in accordance with fable. Myth had no precedent for it. She should have thrown her glove, they said, into some lion's den. She should have asked for a score of venomous heads of the serpents of Lycantara, or demanded the death of any notable dragon, or sent them all upon some deadly quest. But that she could not love them? It was unheard of. It had no parallel in the annals of romance.
Where do new myths come from? I'd note that by the time the PCs hear this, it may not be new. Throwing the glove and asking them to retrieve it is a classic combat encounter which you could build a story around, as is the quest for the heads of the snakes of Lycantara. It's a made-up name, but it contains cantar, which is Latin for a type of poem, from which we get the English chant, and thence enchant. The heads of magical serpents are a bit more puzzling for magi when they note that the symbol of their order is 3 magical serpents, and they may trace back to Thessalian witchcraft. Dunsany runs out of steam here, but the quest potential for the Hand of the Queen is obvious.
And then she said that if they must needs have a quest, she would offer her hand to him who first should move her to tears, and the quest should be called, for reference in histories or song, the quest of the Queen's Tears, and he that achieved them she would wed, be he only a petty duke of lands unknown to romance. And many were moved to anger, for they hoped for some bloody quest, but the old Lord's Chamberlain said, as they muttered among themselves in a far, dark end of the chamber, that the quest was hard and wise, for that if she could ever weep, she might also love. They had known her all her childhood. She had never sighed. Many men had she seen, suitors and courtiers, and had never turned her head after one went by.
I know how modern this sounds, but maybe she's just not into guys. She might be an ace, or she might be gay. She's technically a tree. Maybe she's not really into people. Maybe she's into other trees, or the sun, or something. Player characters can end run her quest by playing that sort of game of symbols.
Her beauty was as still sunsets of bitter evenings when all the world is frore, a wonder and a chill. She was as a sun-stricken mountain uplifted alone, all beautiful with ice, a desolate and lonely radiance late at evening, far up beyond the comfortable world, not quite to be companioned by the stars, the doom of the mountaineer.
It's kind of amazing how far you can get writing Ars Magica material with one set of stats for an Ice Queen. She seems to turn up a lot. Then again, maybe Sylvia's powers are not ice-based, maybe she just has a heart of wood. The doom of the mountaineer will come back to us in just a minute.
If she could weep, they said, she could love, they said. And she smiled pleasantly on those ardent princes and troubadours concealing kingly names. Then one by one they told, each suitor prince, the story of his love, with outstretched hands and kneeling on the knee, and very sorry and pitiful were the tales, so that often up in the galleries some maid of the palace wept, and very graciously she nodded her head, like a listless magnolia in the deeps of the night, moving idly to all the breezes its glorious bloom.
For a fairy, this great outpouring of grief and pain is a feast. She's compared to a magnolia here. This flower is unknown in mythic Europe. The name first develops in the 18th century, and they are native to Southeast Asia and North America. They are a strangely fitting flower. Some magnolias appear very early in the spring, before other plants put forth leaves, so they are the flower of the end of winter. Also, in the real world, the magnolia evolved before the bee. It was pollinated by beetles, and so it's a really solid flower, resistant to damage.
And when the princes had told their desperate loves, and had departed away, with no other spoil than of their own tears only, even then there came the unknown troubadours, and told their tales in song, concealing their gracious names. And there was one, a cronian, clothed with rags on which was the dust of roads, and underneath the rags was war-scarred armour whereon were the dints of blows. And when he stroked his harp and sang his song, in the gallery above maidens wept, and even old lords chamberlain whimpered among themselves, and thereafter laughed through their tears and said, "It is easy to make old people weep and to bring idle tears from lazy girls, but he will not set a weeping the Queen of the Woods." And graciously she nodded, and he was the last. And disconsolate went away those dukes and princes and troubadours in disguise. Yet a cronian pondered as he went away.
A cronian's name has the ion suffix, which means the first part of the name is a verb. Ion comes through various paths from the Greek, so I'd suggest his name is a corruption of acronion. Acros means summit or headland, and it means the state of having travelled to the furthest point. This fits the character's later actions, and I suppose this is either a sign of normative determinism or his actual name has been lost and replaced with a description of his role. This also makes him a mountaineer.
King he was of a farmer, Lul and Haf, overlord of Zerura and hilly Chang, and duke of the dukedoms of Molong and Malash, none of them unfamiliar with romance, or unknown or overlooked in the making of myth.
Is he a fairy prince, so that the names of his kingdoms make no sense, or have they, like another kingdom in one of Dunsany's other longer works, been taken into Faerie? Is this the price of the courtship?
He pondered as he went in his thin disguise. Now by those that do not remember their childhood, having other things to do, be it understood that underneath Fairyland, which is, as all men know, at the edge of the world, there dwelleth the gladsome beast, a synonym he for joy. It is known how the lark in its zenith, children at play out of doors, good witches and jolly old parents have all been compared, how aptly, with this very same gladsome beast. Only one crab he has, if I may use slang for a moment to make myself perfectly clear, only one drawback, and that is that, in the gladness of his heart, he spoils the cabbages of the old man who looks after Fairyland. And, of course, he eats men.
I love that last line, and in mythic Europe it's so true. There are lots of fairies that eat people in one way or another, But destroying the cabbages of the old man who looks after fairyland, that's just the gladsome beast. I'd like to flag him as an example of Nozick's utility monster, an idea we'll come back to in a future episode. I've snuck the Master of Games into mythic Europe, mentioned passingly in a single sentence. He's what I think Titalis becomes once he is lost and consumed in Faerie. I am, however, charmed by the idea that the founder is now an annoyed old guy in a hut at the edge of Faerie and magic, trying to grow a decent cabbage.
It must further be understood that whoever may obtain the tears of the gladsome beast in a bowl, and become drunken upon them, may move all persons to shed tears of joy, so long as he remains inspired by the potion to sing or to make music. Now Acronion pondered in this wise, that if he could obtain the tears of the gladsome beast by means of his art, withholding him from violence by the spell of music, and if a friend should slay the gladsome beast before his weeping ceased, for an end must come to weeping even with men, that so he might get safe away with the tears, and drink them before the Queen of the Woods, and move her to tears of joy. He sought out therefore a humble knightly man, who cared not for the beauty of Sylvia, Queen of the Woods, but had found a woodland maiden of his own once, long ago in summer. And the man's name was Areth, a subject of Acronion, a knight-at-arms of the Spear-Guard, and together they set out through the fields of fable until they came to Fairyland. A kingdom sunning itself, as all men know, for leagues along the edges of the world, and by a strange old pathway they came to the land they sought, through a wind blowing up the pathway sheer from space, with a kind of metallic taste from the roving stars. Even so they came to the windy house of thatch, where dwells the old man who looks after Fairyland, sitting by parlour windows that look away from the world. He made them welcome in his star-walled parlour, telling them tales of space, and when they named to him their perilous quest, he said it would be a charity to kill the gladsome beast, for he was clearly one of those that liked not its happy ways. And then he took them out through his back door, for the front door had no pathway nor even a step. From it the old man used to empty his slops, sheer onto the southern cross, and so they came to the garden wherein his cabbages were, and those flowers that only blow in Fairyland, turning their faces always toward the comet, and he pointed them out the way to the place he called Underneath, where the gladsome beast had his lair.
Dunsany either has a lot of luck or he's deliberately put some very deep cuts of mythology in here. Cabbages, for the Greeks, were created from the tears of King Lycurgus of Thrace. He forced Dionysus from his kingdom and imprisoned his Maenads, and tried to destroy his vines. In revenge, the god made the king think his son was a mature ivy plant, ivy being sacred to Dionysus, and Lycurgus trimmed his son's extremities off so that he bled to death. Then Lycurgus gets fed to meat-eating horses or panthers, depending on who you listen to. Cabbages don't grow well with vines, and if you eat them, they correct the humours for drunkenness. That's a long way to get to a piece of agricultural wisdom, but the cabbage was the potato of the medieval world. It was really important to people. Speaking of cabbages, the headed cabbage doesn't seem to reach Britain until the 14th century. The word cabbage is from a Norman word meaning head. The general class of crops we now call brassicas they called coles, and they did have loose-leaf coles. The Scottish pronunciation, kale, is still used for one type. The earliest cabbage variety doesn't compete well with other plants, but it is salt-resistant, so it dwells best on cliffs overlooking the sea. Is it purely coincidence that the man is growing them on the very edge of the world? Sometimes I wonder if Dunsany is doing deep cuts like this all the time and I'm missing them, or if he's just been lucky.
Then they manoeuvred. Acronion was to go by way of the steps, with his harp and an agate bowl, while Areth went round by a crag on the other side. Then the old man who looks after Fairyland went back to his windy house, muttering angrily as he passed his cabbages, for he did not love the ways of the gladsome beast, and the two friends parted on their separate ways. Nothing perceived them but that ominous crow, glutted overlong already upon the flesh of man. The wind blew bleak from the stars.
As fairy mediates between the mundane and the magical, this wind from the stars may be Vim. The breath of the stars, the wind from space, may be magic in its purest form. How terrible if the world tree is a cabbage. And yet the cabbage is called a brassica because its flower, which tops the plant, looks like a cross. Could this be a metaphor for the ascendance of heaven? Is this something that Titalis, as the old man who looks after Fairyland, is attempting as a way to break out? Could the death of the gladsome beast lead to the cabbages finally going to seed and a crack appearing between fairy and magic? Who built the steps from the lair to the edge? And for what use? Does someone sail that sea? Does someone come to seek out the beast, to feed it or worship it or harvest its tears?
At first there was dangerous climbing, and then Acronion gained the smooth broad steps that led from the edge to the lair, and at that moment heard at the top of the steps the continuous chuckles of the gladsome beast. He feared then that its mirth might be insuperable, not to be saddened by the most grievous song. Nevertheless, he did not turn back then, but softly climbed the stairs, and placing the agate bowl upon a step, struck up the chaunt called Dolores. It told of desolate, regretted things, befallen happy cities long since in the prime of the world. It told of how the gods and beasts and men had long ago loved beautiful companions, and long ago in vain. It told of the golden host of happy hopes, but not of their achieving. It told how love scorned death, but told of death's laughter. The contented chuckles of the gladsome beast suddenly ceased in his lair. He rose and shook himself. He was still unhappy. Acronion still sang on the chaunt called Dolores. The gladsome beast came mournfully up to him. Acronion ceased, not for the sake of his panic, but still sang on. He sang of the malignity of time. 2 tears welled large in the eyes of the gladsome beast. Acronion moved the agate bowl to a suitable spot with his foot.
Dolores means painful in period, but by the time Dunsany was writing, it meant causing grief. Agate bowls really exist and were popular in the Renaissance, although perhaps not of the size found in the Syme illustration, which can be seen on the podcast website, or just Google it. Agate takes its name from the river Achates in Sicily, where they were found in exportable quantities. Agates are said to cure insomnia and nightmares, which seems a useful link for a fairy story.
He sang of autumn and of passing away. Then the beast wept as the frore hills weep in the thaw, and the tears splash big into the agate bowl. Acronion desperately chaunted on. He told of the glad, unnoticed things men see and do not see again, of sunlight beheld unheeded on faces now withered away. The bowl was full. Acronion was desperate. The beast was so close. Once he thought that its mouth was watering, but it was only the tears that had run on the lips of the beast. He felt as a morsel. The beast was ceasing to weep. He sang of worlds that had disappointed the gods, and all of a sudden crash, and the staunch spear of Arath went home behind the shoulder, and the tears and the joyful ways of the gladsome beast were ended and over for ever. And carefully they carried the bowl of tears away, leaving the body of the gladsome beast as a change of diet for the ominous crow.
How does this crow get enough humans that it can subsist here. Presumably this means that the beast hunts humans. But where? Does it leave Fairy and emerge into the real world to hunt?
And going by the windy house of thatch, they said farewell to the old man who looks after Fairyland, who, when he heard of the deed, rubbed his hands together and mumbled again and again, "And a very good thing too, my cabbages, my cabbages." And not long after, a cronian sang again in the sylvan palace of the Queen of the Woods, having first drunk all the tears in his agate bowl. And it was a gala night, and all the court were there, and ambassadors from the lands of legend and myth, and even some from terra cognita.
To explain the difference, legends are meant to be quasi-historical, myths are not factual but are instructive, and terra cognita is where the rest of you are from. I'm from terra incognita, Australis, myself. Games from Folktales, brought to you from the unknown lands.
And a cronian sang as he never sang before, and will not sing again. Oh, but dolorous, dolorous are all the ways of man, few and fierce are his days, and the end trouble, and vain, vain his endeavour, and woman, who shall tell of it? Her doom is written with man's by listless, careless gods, with their faces to other spheres.
If a person begins the dolorous chaunt in the real world, what happens? Does it summon demons? It seems like perhaps it should. Perhaps demons of despair, demons of spiritual sloth, acedia demons, like those mentioned in a previous episode, who, we may recall, had an alliance with the Snow Queen. Is this just a new trick of hers?
Somewhat thus he began, and then inspiration seized him, and all the trouble in the beauty of his song may not be set down by me. There was much of gladness in it, and all mingled with grief. It was like the way of man, it was like our destiny. Sobs arose at his song, sighs came back along echoes, seneschals, soldiers sobbed, and a clear cry made the maidens. Like rain the tears came down from gallery to gallery.
A literal rain of tears sounds like a folkloristic way to break a curse. It also reminds me of an old jazz standard about crying a river.
All round the Queen of the Woods was a storm of sobbing and sorrow. But no, she would not weep.